very excited to be here tonight to talk about something I've been researching ever since I was a student at the University of Dayton, and that is modern Chinese politics. The emphasis for tonight is going to be looking at US-China relations. It's a tough time to talk about US-China relations. I will tell you what I believe is most likely to happen. As I said to Myron when he asked me to do this, I said, could we have a little bit more time right after the inaugural? Because we're shifting quite a bit right now. But I'm going to place this in a bigger context. And the one thing I love about social science, and especially political science, it keeps us on our toes. I was an undergraduate student at the University of Dayton when Tiananmen Square happened. And I watched many of the professors that I was admiring and I wanted to be like when I grow up make these very strong statements about what China would do and wouldn't do, and they were wrong. So it taught me from a very early time to be very careful about making definitive statements. And The Economist, probably a magazine many of you read, a number of years ago had this great article. And at the top it said, nobody knows anything about China. And then it had a little asterisk and it said, including the Chinese government. And I thought that, I've used that on all of my talks over at Wright-Patterson. And I use it because I always like to start out with an air of humility. Be leery of anybody who makes confident statements about China. I would also say be leery about anybody who makes confident statements about American politics, but I'll leave that up to you. Human agency is a very, very powerful thing. And while the Chinese government tries to limit and control what their people do, what do we know about human nature? I always tell my students at Wright State, you go into a room with 1 or 2 two-year-olds, maybe just 1 two-year-old, and you will learn the concept of control as an abstract statement, right? And the Chinese government is trying to control its population. They're successful in some ways by limiting the amount of information they get. But in other ways, they're very, very unsuccessful. So I will couch my comments with that. I'm going to explain a little bit about the subtitle of my talk. One thing that's really cool about Chinese language, they've got set phrases. They're usually very rich with different layers of meaning. And so this is Tong Chuang Yi Meng, and it's same bed, different dreams. And the idea is sometimes you have couples or communities that are cohabiting in the same space, but they're not looking at things the same way. And in many ways, and this is an ancient set phrase in Chinese language, but I think it's very apropos for understanding US-China relations right now. These are the 2 most powerful countries in the world. There's not a single issue that exists in the world today that can be resolved with at least the acquiescence, if not the outright cooperation of these 2 states. Yet, I would contend, just like sometimes Joe and I leave a movie and we talk about it and I'm like, did we see the same movie? Sometimes that's the different dreams that exist right now, I think, between the US and China. And I think it's incumbent upon all of us to try to bring those dreams a little bit more closely in alignment. So for context, and one thing I love about PowerPoint is if you are a visual learner like myself, these images I hope can kind of speak to some of the broader picture. And that puzzle piece picture on the left side of the screen, to me, just speaks volumes. Because you look at that and the puzzle pieces should come together. But do they with the colors, right? And so I think, this idea of this context of the challenges, and these are not new challenges, but they're becoming more severe challenges as China becomes stronger and more engaged with the global community. At the same time, I think the United States is really questioning the degree to which we want to be engaged formally and informally on the world community. So I'm going to start with 3 quotes. First, the US and China must repair their completely dysfunctional relationship. Second, the China-US relationship is experiencing difficulties rarely seen. This quote is 4 years old. This has seriously undermined the fundamental interests of the Chinese and American people. And third, this is a far more recent quote, weeks old. The 21st century will be defined by what happens between the United States and China. The first quote comes from the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres. And he made this statement 4 years ago as an admonishment to the leaders of both countries, saying, We are all in peril because the two of you can't get your act together as two countries. And it's rare to see somebody of such a high diplomatic post with such a finger wagging as Guterres did in that statement. The second statement comes from a longtime Chinese ambassador to the United States, Cui Tiankai. And I believe that this was such a powerful statement coming from him because he literally had a front row seat to many challenging times in the United States-Chinese relationship. And I thought that that was a very powerful concern that he raised. And talking about how, again, the relationship needs to be improved for the good of all people. He highlighted the Chinese and the American people. Then the last statement came from the confirmation hearings for now Secretary of State Marco Rubio. He's had many strong statements about the U.S.-China relationship. He is actually sanctioned as of today, continuing today, by the Chinese government. And we're not sure if those sanctions are going to be lifted. If they're not, even as Secretary of State, he will not be eligible to travel to the People's Republic of China. And he's sanctioned by the Chinese government because he's been one of the most outspoken individuals in the US Congress, speaking of China's many human rights abuses, most notably China's situation in Xinjiang province. I'm going to point to that on a map in just a minute. This is the crackdown on religious minorities throughout China, most notably Muslims in China. And to this day, the range, I checked just this afternoon, the range of individuals who have been imprisoned by the Chinese government solely because of their religious identity goes from 500,000 to 1 million. And those are the known individuals who are imprisoned. And former Senator Rubio, now Secretary of State, has condemned the Chinese government for this, as have many other world leaders. But he was the leader of the legislation in the United States, making sure that no items that were produced within Xinjiang province can be sold in the United States. The Chinese didn't like that, so they sanctioned him. He's had many other statements. Secretary of State Rubio has called China the biggest geopolitical test of the 21st century. So I think the context of these statements coming from three very different perspectives and three very different viewpoints of the world shows again the importance of our topic for tonight's discussion. Now, what are the priorities for Beijing? Because in any relationship, if we want to understand how to improve that relationship, we need to understand what both sides want to try to achieve. And for the Chinese, it's about stability and reemergence. Now, this map is a map showing the linguistic diversity within the People's Republic of China. At the University of Dayton, I started studying Chinese language, unaware of the fact that there are many Chinese languages. We tend to call them dialects, but in the United States, that doesn't translate very well, right? We think of water being a dialect, right, instead of water. Dialects in Chinese language are completely unintelligible unless you have background. So, 我爱你 is I love you in Mandarin. 你贵我嘞 is I love you in Cantonese. That's a lot different than water versus water. So this map is looking at linguistic diversity, but I'm going to use it to talk about ethnic diversity within the People's Republic of China. Not exactly the same thing, but it correlates pretty closely. What you see is a patchwork quilt, okay, especially down here in the South. And I've had an opportunity to do a directed study of Chinese ethnic nationalities in the South. And it was fascinating because we have this image in our mind that all Chinese are the same. Well, of course, we know Americans are diverse, but we tend to think of Chinese all the same. Well, we're talking 1.4 billion people, 1.3, 1.4, of course they're not. But one of the governing challenges that the Chinese government faces is these people have very different aspirations, very different backgrounds, different languages, different ways of doing things. And the Chinese government has been trying since 1949 to pull those together. Now, 92% of the Chinese are a single nationality, known as Han. 8% of 1.3 billion is still a lot of people. And what you see, especially down here, we've got all these different colors, is you've got a concentration of all of those differences. I'm going into this level of detail because governing the People's Republic of China is a very difficult task. And we have to keep that in mind because it guards and it helps influence their sense of what they're able to do. If they're afraid, they wake up, the leaders of the Chinese Communist Party wake up in the morning concerned about exactly this dynamic, about literally holding the country together. And that position of insecurity, which is going to be a big theme of my talk tonight, that insecurity colors and influences how they behave on the global stage. So stability is not taken for granted. Stability is a very real concern for the People's Republic of China and their leadership under the Chinese Communist Party. That second point, re-emergence. A lot of people think of China being strong and powerful for the first time in the 21st century. You all know that's not true. China has been known historically as the Middle Kingdom. If I would write the characters for China on the board, the first character is very beautiful. It's a mouth, it's like a square with a line straight through it. And that idea, being the center of the universe, was not just the idea that the Chinese had of themselves, but importantly, that's the way other people looked at China. They were at the center of the world. They were responsible for many important inventions around the world, including, as I was sharing with Father Jean earlier, one that I think might have been the most important, the wheelbarrow. Right? Do any yard work. Thank the Chinese for being able to get across your yard with that. Obviously, fireworks, metal coins and coin systems. The Chinese were responsible for many of those creations. In the 1500s, they started to become complacent. They thought, we've achieved it. We've gotten to the top. They called back their navy. They stopped interacting with other countries of the world. Guess what? That was the beginning of their decline. So as China today becomes this very important power, economically, politically, even culturally, to them, it's not a new thing. It's not China's rising. It's China returning. It's China's re-emergence. Very important posture to understand if you want to really get into and understand how the Chinese Communist Party sees themselves. I put this map up here because I think it helps us understand, too, geographically, China's size, and also the longitudinal lines as well. China is roughly, the People's Republic of China, is roughly the same size as the United States of America, 4 times the population. And very importantly, with this map, did you notice there's no language written in this kind of pale white color here? Uninhabitable. This is the Tibetan Plateau. It's a very densely populated country. First time my husband joined me in China, the first night I was trying to convince him to cross the street even as traffic was coming in, and he just kept shaking his head. And I was like, we're never going to cross the street in this country unless you take the traffic on. It's very, very densely populated, disorganized and crowded. Every time I come back from China, one of my favorite things to do is to escape to Yellow Springs and see nobody and hear nothing, because I rarely have that experience in China because of that population and that crunch. Now, whenever I teach my class on modern Chinese politics, I subtitle it A Study in Contradictions, because I tell my students, and I will tell you, tonight I will seemingly contradict myself in a couple of statements, but they're probably both going to be true, because China is much more both and than either or. China is still a developing country. Yes, they're the world's second largest economy. Yes, their currency is now tradable as one of the 5 recognized tradable currencies around the world. Largest military, all of that. They're still a developing country. China can also, at the same time that they're the world's largest polluter of greenhouse gases, they're also the country that invests the most in trying to have more green energy. So there's a lot of contradictions within 1.3 billion people in all this territory. Politically, though, for our purposes tonight, I'm going to highlight these 3. China is both weak and strong. It's that weakness and that perception of weakness. China borders 14 countries. Compare that to what we face in the United States. How threatened are we by Canada and Mexico? China borders 14 countries, and they've had 25 border disputes, some of them violent, since their foundation in 49. They're inherently very, very concerned and insecure. At the same time, they project that strength. Largest military, starting to develop one of the quickest growing navies. That's the big story, I think, militarily with China right now. They are pumping out ships like you wouldn't believe. And this all started during COVID. And it happens because the Chinese Communist Party fuses their military shipbuilding with their commercial shipbuilding, because the Chinese Communist Party has that influence over the economy. And so you've got these two shipbuilding yards right next to each other, both growing, and we just can't keep up. So you've got this weakness and this strength right next to each other. Next one. Very important that China has a strong sense of nationalism. Now, we all know that nationalism, this perception, is growing around the world. It's very strong here in the United States as well, right? We've moved from this international identity that was so prominent in the 1990s to much more local nationalist identity. And the Chinese are now very, very proud of everything that they've achieved. They should be in so many ways, right? China, when we had the millennial goals set by the United Nations to cut extreme poverty in half by the time we got to the 2000s, China was able to do that. And because they were able to cut that extreme poverty, that then allowed the whole world to experience that as well. There have been a lot of achievements for which the Chinese people can be very, very proud. Chinese Communist Party can manipulate that nationalism. There's something about controlling all of the levers of information. There is no free press in China. You know that. The internet is very unfree in China. Today, in 2025, the internet is less free than it was 12 months ago in China. That constriction of the freedom is getting worse and worse. So you've got this nationalism and this control. At the same time, there's shame. There's a very strong sense of shame within the Chinese psyche and the government, even as they try to fight it, because of the way they were controlled by imperial powers at the collapse of the last dynasty, beginning in the 1850s. So you can have these two side by side. I would say actually it's a very dangerous combination to have those two, because the more shame, the stronger people are going to rally around anything that makes them feel very, very proud. And the last one, bureaucratic. I know I saw at least one Ohio State sweatshirt. Go Buckeyes. That was a great game the other night. I used to tease that the largest bureaucracy in the world is the People's Republic of China, rivaled only by the bureaucracy at Ohio State University, right? Very large bureaucratic country, difficult to get things done because you follow everything through standard operating procedures. But when it's decided that something is a huge priority, they can be wicked fast. And they can accomplish things very quickly overnight. Perfect example, green energy, where the United States and some other countries are still having debates. Is global warming real? How do we respond to it? Chinese government, the Chinese Communist Party, saw that it was hurting their bottom line. It was hurting their economic growth and development. National priority. All the resources would go to that. Now, fast doesn't always mean good and in quality. I had a friend who was texting me pictures from outside of his apartment building. He said, oh, the bridge is down. I'm going to have to find a different way to get to work. 2 days later, a new bridge is up. And I wrote back, I said, don't go on that bridge, right? If you build something that quickly, it's not going to have that quality. But you can have this back and forth depending on whether or not it is a priority. Now, in looking at the leadership, I want to highlight one very important characteristic of modern Chinese politics, and it's personalism. Who you are as your person, your name, is far more important than your title. You will notice I will be referring to the leader by his name far more than by his title, because, for this particular guy, he holds every title, so it's a little bit irrelevant, but it's the person behind it. From 1949 until today, 2025, there have been 5 paramount leaders of the People's Republic of China. They've held multiple different titles. Some of them, Deng Xiaoping, you probably all remember him, particularly from his role in the 1980s. He actually exercised some of his greatest power when he had no political office at all. The only office he held in the end was chairperson of the China Bridge Association, and it's the card game, not bridges that civil engineers build. He had rescinded all of his other titles, but he was still seen to be very powerful. Each one of these individuals had a very different imprint on the way Chinese politics operated. Mao was the revolutionary, Deng was the reformer, Jiang, who just passed away, I guess now it is 3 years ago, 2.5 years ago, he held it all together after Tiananmen Square. Okay, he was the big stabilizer. Hu Jintao was supposed to be the one that was going to bring regularization and term limits into China. That happened for one person in 2 terms, and now we've got Xi Jinping. You see here, he's been in power since 2012. In 2018, they changed the Chinese state constitution. He has no limits at all to being named president as many times as he wants. There was never a limit for the number of times he could be general secretary of the party, which is his most important title. During that time frame, since 1949, the United States has had 14 presidents. That tells you a lot right there about the power of one individual, where we're going to talk about the power that President Clinton or President Bush had, and the power that they didn't have after they were former President Clinton or former President Bush. That's not the same system here within the People's Republic of China. Highly personalistic system. The picture on the left is one of my favorite pictures to illustrate that. How insecure must you be if you declare that you need an entire wall of the exact same picture of yourself on, right? And he's nicknamed the chairman of everything. And there's a lot of truth behind that. He holds the trifecta in Chinese politics: chairperson of the Chinese Communist Party, president of the People's Republic of China, and chairperson of the Central Military Commission. So head of the state, the party, and the military. He's head of nearly every other office and institution as well. Now, the picture that I have right after that, I would argue politically that that is a huge liability. I just met with our university president today, and we were talking about every office at the university needs to have a succession plan, right? Because we just never know what's going to happen. There's no succession plan in modern Chinese politics. And this has been a problem throughout each one of these individuals, possibly with the exception of number 4. Many of you are probably familiar with the Chinese Cultural Revolution. One of the main reasons why that was launched was for Mao to test his successor, and many people failed. So trying to figure out who's going to follow, having that blank frame after him, and more importantly, not really having a structure for how to decide the successor is a big issue. And this leads to a concept we have in politics of a dictator's dilemma. A dictator thinks they've got all that control, but here's the thing, they don't have the information, right? They don't, because there aren't those free channels of information for people to stage complaints and for individuals and office holders to be able to say, this is working, this isn't working. They don't get the good information, and then they don't make good policy. I'm going to stop there because this touches on my dissertation topic, and we'll be here till spring if you get me talking on that topic. But a lack of information heading to the leader and a lack of courage that other members of the government have in trying to say, hey, this is the way we're going to need to deal with the United States, not the way you're dealing with them. That lack of frankness really limits politically what they're able to achieve. Okay, I just want to, for a couple minutes, give you the big picture of US-China relations so you know where we're going from where to where. Very importantly, there were no relations for quite a long period of time. From 1949, which is the foundation of the People's Republic of China, until 1972, we had a period of isolation. The picture that I show there is from 1943, where you've got Chiang Kai-shek, FDR, and Winston Churchill. Okay, and they were sitting together at the Cairo Conference in 1943. I put that picture up there because, of course, China, the country, existed at the time. But there was a lot of unease. Do we talk to the nationalists, which is who Chiang Kai-shek represented? Or do we talk to the communists? 1940s, is the United States going to talk to a communist? Of course not, right? This was the beginning of the Cold War. So there were no ties, and that continued until the 1970s. Now, many of you are probably very familiar with the strategic triangle concept and the opening of ties between the United States and China in the 1970s. Unbelievable story. I contend it could not happen today because of social media and the presence of cameras everywhere, because there really was a secret opening. Google Nixon's China Game. It was a wonderful PBS series, and it's not shown on PBS anymore, but you can still watch it a little bit through YouTube. It has a perfect first-hand account of many of the players of this opening. Richard Nixon made his secret trip by way of Pakistan. He met Mao Zedong in 1971, shocked the world when Kissinger went on national television. Simultaneously, the Chinese made the announcement that the Chinese and the Americans were going to meet. It was just, nobody could believe that that was going to happen. Nixon then went and had a very successful visit. Mao Zedong was already very much ailing and starting to lose quite a bit of power at that time in 1972. It was only in 1979 that we were able to finalize and formalize the relationship between the United States and the People's Republic of China. Now you see that picture from 1979 includes Jimmy Carter. These pictures are conveying a very important point. It is extremely inaccurate to frame US-China relations through a partisan lens. You can't say the Democrats always do this with China and the Republicans always do this. What's more important is who's in power. And Jimmy Carter, he was supposed to be the human rights president, right? He was vilified when he announced that he was going to finish the work that Republican Richard Nixon did. Richard Nixon was criticized too because he was such a staunch anti-communist. They said, how are you visiting with the commies? Well, he had a strategy. His idea, and in many ways it did work at the time, was to split the communist world. He saw that there was a lot of tension between the Soviets and the Chinese communists. If the United States befriended the Chinese, it was going to force the Soviets to the table. And that was the strategy behind it. But importantly, it was started by a Republican, it was finalized by a Democrat. And we could see that theme carried out time and time again with modern relations between the United States and China. Individuals will hold one viewpoint as candidates. They'll hold a very different viewpoint once they're in office. 1980s, a honeymoon, right? There was so much excitement about how could, perspective from the United States, how can we change the Chinese? How can we teach them our ways? We sold them Kentucky Fried Chicken and Coca-Cola, and they were going to capitalize. They were going to democratize. There was a lot of excitement. Here's a picture of 1984 with President Reagan meeting with the chairperson of the Communist Party at the time, Zhao Ziyang. You know the crash landing that I'm heading to here, June 4th, 1989. Absolute shock on the part of the United States and many other countries as well, that the Chinese Communist Party was still that type of communist party, that they would actually fire on their citizens. That shock extended within the PRC as well. The students, the military, even members of the military. Here's one often untold story about Tiananmen Square. The first military unit that was sent into Tiananmen Square to clear the square turned around. They all lost their jobs. But they turned around because they knew the students that they were being told to fire on, because they had their summer training in Beijing. And of course, everybody went out to the same pubs that night, right? Military members knew the students that were occupying the square. The military units that cleared the square came from central China. They had only seen the government's version of events, and they were the ones who very brutally cleared the square beginning the night of June 4th, 1989. Very strong statements made immediately after that. We will no longer interact with China until they redress this, until they account for it. Well, that statement was made in June. By July, the Germans were back in. We now know by October, US companies were working their way back in. It changed. It was the market imperative took over. And all of a sudden, those memories of Tank Man, one of the most powerful images of the 20th century, they faded in the background. That led to a period of caution and reconfiguration throughout the 1990s. I used this very famous picture of Bill Clinton toasting Jiang Zemin because when Bill Clinton was running for president in the immediate wake after Tiananmen Square, he talked about the butchers of Beijing. He said we must punish the Chinese for what they did to Tiananmen Square. And then a couple years later, he was toasting him. And again, I could find this with nearly every other president where you get that switch. Partisanship does not help explain US-China relations. Through the 2000s, but especially 2008, when Beijing hosted the Olympic Games, many of you probably remember watching, this was China's soft power rising. There's a picture of President Bush meeting with Hu Jintao. And Hu Jintao presided over the Chinese Communist Party during a high point and a low point. High point, opening of the Olympic Games, okay, because that was China's coming out party. And that's essentially what they called it. They invested so much energy, attention, and resources into it. Shortly before the games happened, they had the Sichuan earthquake, which was absolutely devastating. And his response to that, I would say, was mixed. That brings us to the last phase, or the current phase, not the last phase, of US-China relations. And this is China's very strong re-emergence. And it's why I wanted to highlight that historical point earlier. It's not China's rise for the first time. It's their re-emergence in nearly every sphere. So let's talk a little bit about the dramatic shift in Chinese foreign policy during the reign of these leaders. I'm just going to go from Deng Xiaoping, who became the leader in 1980, to the current leader, Xi Jinping. By the way, media always gets the pronunciation of his name wrong. Oftentimes they say it like a Z, like G or Zhu. It's just like S-H-E, like the female pronoun. Okay, Xi Jinping. Deng Xiaoping, hide your strengths, bide your time. Okay, essentially hold your cards real close to your chest. Xi Jinping, very different posture. Ride the mighty east wind of the new era. This is language directly out of the Cultural Revolution. Okay, this mighty east wind, that was a very famous Maoist phrase. Charge forward with a full tank. He made this statement at the National People's Congress meeting. That's what NPC is. That's the Chinese legislature in March of 2018. Very importantly, that was a legislative meeting when they erased all term limits for President of the People's Republic of China. Couple of highlights. Surrounded by insecurity. I highlighted this earlier. Bordering 14 countries. Couched in suspicions and victimization. Remember when I introduced the contradictions at the top of the talk and I talked about nationalism plus shame? The Chinese are very pointedly educate their youth all the way through adulthood that China was unfairly taken advantage of by imperial powers, particularly from the 1830s forward, starting with the British takeover of Hong Kong and occupation of Hong Kong from 1850 until 1997, going into other areas as well. And it's true, China was occupied. China had a quasi-imperial experience. The entire country was never fully occupied, but if we would go back up to that map, most of the eastern seaboard, most of the interactive and developed part of China was controlled by foreign powers, primarily European powers. So they had the century of shame that they believed they were only able to overcome with the Chinese Communist Party as they became victorious. More recently, they believe the United States is trying to contain them. I would bet money that over the next couple of weeks, as we see more pronouncements come from the Trump administration about how to work with China, you're going to see a Chinese response saying, nah, that's just another way that they're trying to contain us. Well, it's not completely untrue, right? We do want to limit what China's being able to influence, but the Chinese frame that as that we're trying to kind of seal them off and contain them. And then another very important part of the way the Chinese see themselves and their foreign policy prefer one-on-one negotiations. Think about why that might be the case. When China sits in a room with Singapore, who has more power, right? If China is sitting in the room with ASEAN, with the Association of Southeast Asian States, they can feel ganged up on. Preferring and having that strong preference for one-on-one relationships is a power play by them. And I would argue, and it'll be one of my concluding points here in just a little bit, one of the biggest strengths the United States has vis-a-vis China, the United States is embedded in a series of alliance relationships. Does that get us into trouble sometimes? It sure does. Does that sometimes mean that we can't always accomplish what we want? Yes. China still eschews any of those entanglements, what they call them, and they want to go it alone. And we'll see if that's going to be very successful for them going forward. Now, I want to give you a further picture about the regional dynamics, because I think this also helps us understand a lot of what China's trying to achieve and project around the world. First, It's a fact. The United States is a Pacific power. The current terminology is Indo-PACOM, or Indo-Pacific region. The United States, and it might be harder for those of us in the Midwest to recognize it, but we form a line along the Pacific, and we have not only interest, but geography within that area. U.S. presence is viewed as crucial for maintaining stability and for working with our allies. And to the extent that that changes, that's really going to put more points on the Chinese side of the equation. But this is a really brilliant map that The Economist put out, and it shows the perspective from Beijing. Okay, so China's in gray there. The blue countries, the dark blue countries, so Japan, Thailand, Australia, the Philippines, Korea, those are allies, strong, staunch allies of the United States. Then what you have with kind of that mustard color, Mongolia is the biggest one there, also Taiwan, those are long-standing partners. We can't be allies necessarily with Taiwan because we don't recognize Taiwan as an independent country. We're going to jump to that in just a couple minutes. Here's the real dynamic though. If you look at kind of that lighter yellow color, those are emerging partners. For a minute, take your US glasses off and look at it through the lens of Beijing. When they're looking out both at their 14 borders, but also the countries around them, you can understand why they feel encircled by the United States. You can understand why they feel some of that containment, especially as we have in the last 4 years really been working to strengthen and grow many of those alliances. So you can see some of that issue of feeling strangled by US power. I want to show you one other section of the regional dynamics, and then we're going to cut to Taiwan because of its importance in this relationship. So we already talked about US alliances and that China prefers one-on-one. What countries need to do is decide, are we going to put all of our eggs in a basket with the United States, or are we going to put all of our eggs in a basket with China? It's not an easy choice, especially for our security partners throughout East Asia. When I work with our partners at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, most of the officers that I meet with are working, oftentimes in military sales, are working with our partners in Asia, in East Asia and Southeast Asia. And they help me understand this point every single time I meet with them. They say the United States promises that they're going to provide our security, but China's given us a lot of money, or China's giving us a lot of this resource, or China's here now. And that puts our partners in a really difficult bind. When you have a chance to look at this on an individual slide later, you see that this is not just an issue that our security partners in East Asia deal with. It's also many of our European partners and allies as well. The top group, the green, is that they want to be partners with the United States, but not China. Dark blue, which is to the far right, is China, but not the United States. So the top goes from Poland to India, Canada, the Netherlands, higher, leaning toward the United States, not China. The bottom is no clear majority or plurality, which is very concerning because Greece, Brazil, France, and Spain are in this category. And it's because of the financial imperative. It's because China, until very recently, has had yuan to spare, dollars, but Chinese yuan to just throw out around the world. COVID changed that. Do not believe any economic statistic that comes from the People's Republic of China. One of my friends who's an economist posted yesterday, I am so surprised. The Chinese government said that the growth rate in 2024 was 5.4%. They predicted 3 years ago it was going to be 5.4%. That number is cooked. It's completely cooked. They are not releasing the accurate economic statistics. They're so afraid about youth unemployment, which by most estimates is approximately 16%. They're so afraid about youth unemployment, they won't release it for their own people. The Chinese economy is not healthy. That is going to change a lot of this dynamic because you see, China has long been the preferred economic partner because they've had the money. Oftentimes they say without strings, there are strings, right? Our colleagues and our friends throughout the continent of Africa have learned this. As China goes in and they promise major infrastructure projects, they build big soccer stadiums, they build bridges and highways. They are employing only Chinese individuals, they are taxing the developments, or they are then leasing that land, which really becoming a very sad story. But the Chinese economy is really beginning to falter and is going to change this dynamic. Notice, though, the picture at the bottom and the current situation emerging. China is becoming not only a security partner, but an internal security partner. The surveillance right now within the People's Republic of China is unbelievable. One of my friends went to China for the first time and he said, it was so wonderful. I got off the plane and there was this big screen and it said, George, welcome to China. You want to go to gate 13C. And he's like, that was so cool. I said, that was so creepy. Yeah, they could read his information from his phone and then project that. The amount of surveillance, much of this has been tested in Xinjiang province. It's a big part of the story of why they have been incarcerating Muslims, but they've been testing it there. Not only are they using it throughout the country, they're exporting it. They're exporting it to Brazil. They're exporting it throughout Africa. They're exporting it to many of the Middle Eastern partners as well. This is the challenge of leadership between the United States and China. In what sort of image are we going to project? I'm going to introduce the big picture of the goals of the two, and then we're going to spend our last 10 minutes of the hour talking about Taiwan, because that is, without a doubt, the most significant and consequential issue in relations between the United States and China. So you see here in red, China's grand strategy, complete territorial integrity. That complete, right, by the way, is the verb complete, okay? Back to that century of shame where the country was carved up by imperial powers, the last piece of the puzzle in their mind that is missing is Taiwan, okay? And they believe, the Chinese Communist Party believes, the reintegration of Taiwan with mainland China is, to quote Chinese leader Xi Jinping, inevitable. That's what they mean there. Prevent regional hegemonism. That means keep the United States out of our backyard. Third, promote economic growth and development. We've been talking, complete their re-emergence, okay, return to the scale. What are the priorities vis-a-vis China from Washington, D.C.? Maintain a free and open Indo-Pacific. Okay, in case you're less familiar with that terminology, the map in green encompasses the countries that are included in the Indo-Pacific. It is very wide-ranging. It stretches from Yemen and Oman, touching Saudi Arabia, to India, to Australia. The United States, this area has so much of the container traffic, so much of global trade that goes through it. 70% by volume, 80% by value going through this area. If China starts to restrict trade traffic through that area, it's going to have huge consequences. That's why that's a priority for the United States. Respond to their military modernization, especially space. Many of you have been living in Dayton for quite a few number of years. You know the importance of Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Many of you probably have worked there. National Space Intelligence Center and Space Force, it's huge that we have that housed here. And NSIC is growing to almost rival NASIC, the National Air and Space Intelligence Center. Why? Because we need to catch up to China in outer space. China has invested in shipbuilding. China has invested in outer space. And so we need to respond to that. That relates to number 3 about cyber, and then counter the Beijing consensus, especially in the global south. You're probably familiar with the Washington consensus, where we believe that if you introduce good old capitalism and free markets, then democracy is going to follow. The Beijing consensus is the opposite of that. Control your political system and then have as much of a free market as your government will allow. And just like China is trying to export surveillance technology, they're trying to export this model as well. So those are some of the priorities. Now let's just go to Taiwan. Because Taiwan shows, I remember one of Joe's first comments when I was in grad school, he says, wow, you really pay attention to the meaning of particular words now. It all seems very rhetorical. And I said, yeah, it is very rhetorical. And in so many ways, the words matter. And where this should be a very simple trivia question, how many Chinas are there? It really is not a very simple answer. So the United States and China have consistently throughout their relationship, dating from even from the 1940s, before it was with the Chinese Communist Party, recognized one China. The problem is, who is that one China? Many of you have probably been to the United Nations World Headquarters in New York City. China is recognized as a founding country of the United Nations system. China in 1945 was the Republic of China on Taiwan, the Nationalist Party led by Chiang Kai-shek. China in the 1970s, beginning in 1972 in the United Nations, was the Chinese Communist Party on mainland China. So that's why I put these two maps here. You see the map on the left is pointing to Taiwan, approximately 23 million people, an island that you can drive north to south very easily in a day, compared to 1.3 billion people on mainland China. The United States abides by a one China policy. By that we mean we recognize that the People's Republic of China believes China and Taiwan are one unit. That's not saying that we agree. We recognize one China. We recognize that Beijing sees themselves as the legitimate leader of one China. But we recognize this is a red line and a big issue for the Chinese Communist Party. China abides by the one China principle. This is where the words really matter. The principle is that China and Taiwan are inalienably connected, and they cannot be separated. And this is where it becomes tricky, because since the 1940s, when China ended a civil war between the nationalists and the communists, they have not had these interactions. And Taiwan operated independently from the People's Republic of China for decades, until the late 1970s. On Taiwan, they held elections for representation in all of the provinces of mainland China. Even though people had never even been to mainland China. They started to move away from that. Taiwan has been working to achieve its own independent political identity. This map here shows the number of states and the location of the states that to this day recognize the Republic of China on Taiwan as the government of that one China. Now, look at those states, and I would love to hear which one you think is the most powerful. Of course, power is a very contested concept. I would argue it's the Holy See, because even though it's the smallest state, it is a state because of its connection to Catholics all around the world that influences the most people. The Holy See seriously considered severing ties with the Republic of China on Taiwan and opening those ties with the People's Republic of China. You can't be best friends with both. You choose one or the other. They very much considered doing that under Pope Benedict. They withdrew largely because of China's crackdown on religious minorities, especially the Muslims in Xinjiang province. But if Taiwan would lose the Holy See, not only do they go down to 11, and you see these are all very small states, mostly global south states, they have been bought off, and there has been a lot of back and forth with countries. You see the last one to switch was Nauru. Right after the Taiwanese had their most recent presidential election, right after those results were announced, boom, Chinese Communist Party offered a very high sum to Nauru, and they switched their recognition. Here's the irony, though. As Taiwan lost this representation, and 22 states recognized Taiwan in 2016. It's down to 12 now. As they've lost that recognition, Taiwan's identity and Taiwan's presence and recognition around the world has only grown. And the current president, they just had elections last year. Current president, Lai Ching-te, a surname goes first, that's why I underlined it, so he would be President Lai. He said, I don't need to announce the establishment of Taiwanese independence. We're already independent. That is, as we get closer and closer, and by nearly every shape of the imagination, they have their own currency. They drive on the other side of the road than they do on mainland China. In many, many ways, they have this independence, yet the Chinese Communist Party still continues this idea that they are part of the one China. And they do that because it's a major source of their legitimacy. Remember the strategies I was talking about earlier? Regain that territorial integrity. Taiwan is the first point on that. I wanted to point out their vice president, Xiao. She actually was envoy to the United States for a number of years. And she brought a lot of the political heft to the ticket. He's a medical doctor who had very little political experience. But Xiao, because of some of her political background and her ties here in the United States, really brought a lot to that. And then this is some opinion data highlighting the step and the changes within Taiwan, asking people, do you identify primarily as Chinese or Taiwanese? And what we're seeing, as you might expect, when there's less interaction going across the two borders, more and more, particularly among the younger generation, they're seeing themselves as distinctly Taiwanese. And this is a real political conundrum for Beijing. Just want to highlight how involved the United States is in this, because it is absolutely crucial. If you see this map here, this map zeroes in on the southeastern coast of China. So the part of the coast that's facing Taiwan, that is approximately 100 miles across the Taiwan Strait. Okay, that waterway there, 50% of global containers travel through that strait. And it was the United States Sixth Fleet under Truman, when he placed the Sixth Fleet in the middle of that strait during the Korean War to keep China from invading Taiwan, that figuratively, and I would argue literally, has kept the United States right in between these two players. When Nixon went to China, he signed the Shanghai Communique, where we said, we will renounce our relationship with the ROC, Republic of China, in order to formalize with the People's Republic. You can't do both. So in 72, we said we would do that. That's when we announced our one China policy that I referred to earlier. Then, when this came to the United States and when Carter finalized it, Congress went nuts. And they said, how can we give up our partner for all of these years? And so in response, somewhat kind of retaliation for the normalization of relations between Communist China and the United States, we passed the Taiwan Relations Act. This Taiwan Relations Act states that we recognize that there is one China. We recognize that China claims Taiwan and China as one country. But the resolution across the Taiwan Strait should be peaceful. The legislation, this is US law, not treaty. I can't tell you how many times the media says there's a treaty called the Taiwan Relations Act. This is only here within the United States. In the Taiwan Relations Act, we say, if other than peaceful means are used to unify Taiwan and mainland China, the United States may intervene. Key words. That's why we call it ambiguity, but it was strategic ambiguity to try to maintain the peace during a very difficult era. The challenge is the era of strategic ambiguity ending? And there's been a lot of talk. There's been a number of individuals, including some of our military leaders, who have said we are now in the crucial decade for finalizing, or for the Chinese Communist Party to finalize this ambiguous peace across the Taiwan Strait. I will end my formal comments before we take questions by saying, please be leery of any formal timelines that we believe international leaders with whom we don't have that many conversations hold. Because the more that we say, and some of our leaders have said, 2027 is the year. If Taiwan doesn't get over its issues by 2027, China's going to invade. There's a couple of reasons why they give that year. It's a military deadline, a couple other points, and Xi Jinping can't lead forever. The more we put that date out there, the more we're going to make it a real thing. And this is where I think we need to be very, very cautious. We've had this ambiguous peace that has held, very important peace. We're talking about a lot of people. We're talking about a lot of lives here. That peace has held for this long. We need to figure out what kind of ambiguous win-win solution can we find going forward. And that's not going to be easy, but it's absolutely imperative.